Hi, and welcome to this video. We're looking at the story of Abraham as it's presented in Genesis. This is number 5 in the series. I've been calling the series Stage 2 because it follows a series in which we looked at the very first chapters of Genesis 1 through 11. I called that Beginnings. I'm calling this one Stage 2, but I think we're going to try to rename the series something a bit more accurate and descriptive, the story of Abraham, or something like that. So you might notice a change there in the playlist. Anyway, we've been seeing a bit of Abraham and a lot of him, and seeing that in terms of his character, there's some rough spots there, absolutely. We've also noticed, especially in the last couple of videos, that God's commitment to fulfill his promise to Abraham, that is to make him the father or the ancestor of many, many people who will bring God's blessings to all the world, that promise, that covenant, is something that God makes as a unilateral one, that's unconditional. God takes it upon himself that he's going to fulfill this promise without requiring anything from Abraham. That's going to change a little bit. I'm not sure it's going to change, but Abraham is going to be given something to do, which is a sign of the covenant, and so there will be some aspect, some way in which he also contributes to the dynamic of covenant as it's unfolding in the story of Abraham. Again, we're going to see that he falters in terms of his confidence in what God's going to do. And also we're going to notice that Sarah, his wife, is also expresses some hesitation about totally buying into what God has been promising. Anyway, we're picking it up at the beginning of chapter 17 in Genesis. So I'm reading from a more traditional rendering of the Bible, a more traditional translation. This one is called, I think, the HarperCollins New Revised Standard Version. And I've often been using a version called The Message, which I think captures some of the dynamism, but maybe just for a change of pace, we'll go with a slightly different type of reading in this video. So beginning in chapter 17, Abraham's at 99 years old, so time is moving on. He isn't getting any younger, and God's appearing to Abraham and says to Abraham, walk with me, walk before me, and be blameless. Walking before me, not so much in the literal sense of taking the lead, but in the sense of walk in where I can see you, live in my presence, and be blameless, do right. And then God says, I'm going to make my covenant between me and you, which we might say he's already done, but this keeps being repeated throughout the story of Abraham, which I think adds to the sense of the tremendous commitment that is being revealed section by section. It builds up and it builds up as the story moves on. So Abraham prays and falls on his face, and then God speaks, and again he takes the initiative. He says, you'll be the ancestor of a multitude of people. And then here's kind of a cool thing. He says, your name's going to change. Now, up to this time, I've been calling our friend Abraham, but in the text up to this point, his name has been Abram. And it's at this point that his name changes to Abraham, just I think for the sake of simplicity and not confusing people. I've been calling him Abraham, but it's at this point that the name changes from Abram to Abraham. And it's kind of like here, this is how it reads, your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you the ancestor of a multitude of nations. So Abraham's name means something like Abraham the many, or something like that, or Abraham the ancestor of many. That sounds kind of clumsy, so I just kind of shorten it down to Abraham the many. Anyway, the students of Hebrew will know a bit more about how to render that accurately, but I think that kind of gets at the sense of what's going on here. And then God goes on to say, I'm going to make a great nation of you. Kings of other nations will come to you. By the way, kings of other nations coming to the children of Abraham. Remember the story of, they're usually called the three wise men. When Jesus is born, they come and worship Jesus. That's getting way ahead of the game, but there's a connection there that you can check out absolutely. Anyway, God continues, I'm going to make this everlasting covenant with you, and I'll give to your offspring all this land, and it'll be for your perpetual holding, and I will be their God. So God's kind of reworking some of what he's been saying in the past, but essentially saying the same thing. Many children, a great nation, lots of land, I will be their God. And the nations will come to you. They will be blessed by you. So then we get to a part that's, when you read it, and if you haven't come across this kind of thing before, it may seem a little challenging. But anyway, God says, here's what I want you to do, Abraham. I want you and all of the males in your household, all of your offspring, all the male offspring, to be circumcised. So you'll do this as a sign of the covenant between me and you. It's interesting because we see here, even in the beginning of this chapter, God has not stipulated anything for Abraham to do to be in agreement with God on what's going to happen. It's been all kind of one-sided, and again, God's taking the initiative. But Abraham, I do want you, God says, to at least have a sign of the covenant on you. It's a physical thing. And circumcision, by the way, well, maybe not by the way, maybe this is important to know. Not an unheard of thing by any means in the ancient Near East, practiced by a number of societies at different times. So what God is calling upon Abraham to do is not, I don't think, unheard of to Abraham. And so he does this. The slaves, any of the servants, any foreigners who happen to be in your house, they need to be circumcised as a sign that God is the God of these people. There's a kind of a tough worded warning at the end of the section. Any uncircumcised male who's not circumcised will be cut off from his people because he's broken my covenant. So there's an element of seriousness. Take it seriously. God is saying to Abraham and to his offspring, take my covenant seriously, and take the sign of the covenant that I'm telling you to wear. Take that seriously. Well, Abraham's name has been changed. What about Sarah? This next verse 15. Sarah is well, her name was Sarai, Sarai in the English, of course it's Hebrew. But from now on, her name will be Sarah. And the meaning that I'm coming across in my studies here is that the name means something like princess. So Abraham the many and Princess Sarah. It's kind of a cool way to look at this couple. Anyway, God again repeats his promise that Abraham will have a son, but this time there's no lack of clarity about who's going to be the mother, because in the previous chapter there's that whole episode with Sarah's servant Hagar. Sarah gives Hagar, her servant, to Abraham to impregnate, which happens. Ishmael is born, and then there's a great big thing about what's going to happen, and God has to take charge and so forth, which he does, and it all kind of works out. But anyway, there's no lack of clarity any longer that it's not only going to be Abraham's son, but it's also going to be the son of not another woman, or another wife or a servant or anyone. It's going to be Sarah. Is going to be the mother. Anyway, Abraham, again, it says he laughed to himself. Now, in some of the commentaries I'm reading, it says it was kind of a non-deliberate kind of laughter. So, okay, but he's laughing because, Sarah, he says, she's 99 years old. Come on, is that going to happen? And so Abraham says, what about Ishmael? That son who was born from Hagar. Can't maybe God, he could be the one after all, because this was the original plan. And so the end of the chapter kind of ends this way, with God making it very clear, no, Abraham, it's not going to be Ishmael. That's not my plan. My plan is that you and Sarah are going to be the parents of this child. So that's all now clarified. God says, Sarah shall bear to you at this season next year, and in fact the name is given. My covenant I will establish with Isaac. That's going to be the name of the son. Now, Isaac means something like laughter. Abraham laughed. Isaac means laughter. We're going to come back to the theme of laughter in another minute or two, so hang in there with me. Anyway, then we wrap things up. Abraham also takes Ishmael and all of his slaves, his whole household, and they also are circumcised. So, and God promises Abraham, look, Abraham, I've got some good things in store for Ishmael also. He will be the father of 12 princes. So you might know that down the road, God's people also are going to come from the 12 sons of Jacob. So Abraham and Sarah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then the 12 sons of Jacob. So this is also echoed in what's going to happen to Ishmael and his offspring. So God's got some good things for Ishmael also, and so then not only is Abraham and then eventually Isaac and his offspring in God's view and living out their lives in accordance with God's intentions, but also God has a claim on Ishmael and his descendants, I think, which is important. I mentioned this in a previous video, where it's not just Abraham and his offspring who become the Jewish people. It's not just the Jewish people who God has in view, but all the people of the Middle East, so that when the Jewish people say, hey, look, God has revealed himself to us in a special way, we're here to share it with you, that there's a foundation for those other tribes and nations and clans to be receptive to what the Jewish people are going to bring to them down the road. Now, that's not always welcomed, but and there's definitely some very difficult things which we'll discover later on as we work our way through Genesis. But some difficult things among all those people groups. But there's that claim that God already has on those other people groups. Nevertheless, the covenant, the covenant of establishing a people who are going to be a blessing to all the nations of the earth, that is going to happen through Abraham, Sarah, and Isaac, not through Ishmael. So God's hearing Abraham's prayer to bless Ishmael, but the original plan, covenant, is through Isaac. So let's keep going for a few minutes, because that's just chapter 17. Chapter 18, this is an interesting story. It's maybe some time has passed. Well, maybe not too much, because they're getting on. They're getting old, and God has already said by this time next year, I think. So this season next year. So anyway, Abraham and his entourage, his household, they're by the oaks of Mamre, and Abraham's sitting at his tent, and he's looking up, and he's seeing 3 men approach the encampment. So he runs out, and I think with typical Middle Eastern hospitality of that time, maybe of today too. I've not traveled to the Middle East, but my understanding is that the culture of hospitality there is a little more exuberant than we might find in European or North American societies where I've spent my life. Anyway, they lay out a nice spread, a nice meal for the guests, and it turns out that the three are angels or messengers from the Lord, and that one of them turns out to be the Lord. So there's kind of a doubling up of some of the images here. The three messengers, but one of them turns out to be the Lord himself. So they are there with Abraham and Sarah, and they're partaking in the food, and so the three visitors say, Abraham, where's Sarah? And I don't know. I'm trying to read here quickly whether she was involved in providing the food or whether some of the other servants were. But anyway, she can kind of hear what's going on, but she's not really there. And so Sarah overhears God, turns out, saying again that Sarah will, within a year, have a child. And she laughs. Now, I think the implication here is that her laughter was not quite as innocent as Abraham's in the earlier chapter. And the speaker says to kind of scold Sarah, is anything too wonderful for the Lord? At the set time, I will return to you in due season, and Sarah shall have a son. And Sarah denied it, maybe feeling uncomfortable. I did not laugh. It says because she was afraid. And he says, oh yes, but you did laugh. We get to the end of chapter 18, and I think I'm going to call it a day right there. There's some interesting things that happen there, because in the end of chapter 18, God begins to consult with Abraham about the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah. So that's a very interesting story on a number of levels, so we'll get into that next time. And of course that will lead us into the story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, about which there is some controversy now and then, so I hope to be able to handle that with you in a reasonable way when we get there. And so we'll continue on with 18 and part of 19, maybe all of it, next time. So thanks so much for watching. Hope this has been a great help to you. I'll see you next time. In the meantime, be well. Bye-bye.